Good morning, everyone. I'm Michael Greenwald, Deputy Director of North America Trilateral Commission. On behalf of my colleague, Cassandra Favart, Megan O'Sullivan, Richard Fontaine, we are so fortunate and lucky to have Brent McIntosh, Undersecretary for International Affairs at the U.S. Treasury, here with us this morning. Brent has played an incredibly important role in Treasury's efforts over the last few years. And previously, Brent was the General Counsel at the Treasury and has an esteemed and deep background. But I want to jump right in. And so, good morning, Brent. It's great to see you.
Morning. It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
I know the Undersecretary has one of the best offices in Treasury, one of my favorite offices. And when I would give tours at Treasury, I'd always stop by. So I know this is, I like your background, but I do miss seeing your office behind you. Tell us about your role at Treasury as the Undersecretary for International Affairs.
Thanks. You're right. It is an amazing office. It's one of the great honors of the office to be able to sit in the office. It's the suite where Andrew Johnson sat as President of the United States after the assassination of President Lincoln when he needed an office while Mary Todd Lincoln was still grieving in the White House. So it was for 6 or so weeks the office of the president, and consequently it's decorated as you would expect. It still looks like it did in 1865. So. It's the job of Undersecretary is a fascinating one. It's in some ways the chief financial diplomat for the United States, or chief economic diplomat for the United States. So the job is to engage in any matter that relates to U.S. economic and financial well-being as it touches the international community. And so that's things like engagement with the G7 and the G20 in the finance ministerial track that they have. We're currently the president of the G7 for this year, so coordinating that effort. It's work on the Financial Stability Board, which is an outgrowth of the global financial crisis, a coordinating body for finance ministries and regulators and central banks in major countries. Where in fact this morning at 7 a.m. we had our Financial Stability Board plenary committee meeting to discuss what's going to be done in the coming year, and also the evaluation of vulnerabilities arising out of the pandemic. It's coordination with the OECD. It's a lot of bilateral engagements. So to put that in context, I was in Bolivia this weekend for the inauguration of President Arce there, and part of an effort to strengthen and deepen our relationship with Bolivia, which has been rocky over the past decade and a half. Before that, a week before that, I was in Southeast Asia, in Indonesia, Vietnam, and Myanmar. And it's also our relationship with the IMF and the World Bank and the other multilateral development banks, which play a critical role in the international financial architecture in any time, and are all the more important during a pandemic when the aid that they provide and the assistance that they provide can be very meaningful in driving results in countries that really desperately do need that. So as you would imagine, it's usually a job in which I'm on the road a couple times a month internationally, which came to a crashing halt in March, as did basically all international travel. Had been in both Asia and the Middle East in February, and then didn't travel again until the Southeast Asia trip I just mentioned. So it's a fascinating job, and one that looks a little different during the pandemic.
So tell us, before we jump into some of the concrete issues and priorities as Undersecretary of the Treasury, and we're gonna, just for the group here, we're gonna leave 15 minutes for Q&A. So please stand ready for some robust Q&A for Brent. But before you became Undersecretary, you were General Counsel. Tell us, I mean, that's a huge position, large mandate, big responsibility. How did you first come to that position, and how did General Counsel prepare you for the work you're currently undertaking?
Yeah, great question. It was a real privilege to serve as General Counsel. There are about 2,000 lawyers at Treasury, and the General Counsel is the head of the legal division of Treasury, and they are some of the most talented civil servants anywhere in the government. It really is it's a great law firm, if you will. I became the General Counsel in August of 2017 after being nominated by the President, confirmed by the Senate. It was a job I was interested in part because I saw my friend Bob Hoyt, who is just transitioning now from being General Counsel at Barclays to being General Counsel at HSBC. But my friend Bob Hoyt had done it during the global financial crisis, and I saw the contribution he made to the recovery from the global financial crisis and thought it would be a place where you could make a real contribution in public service, in particular as a lawyer with a financial services background. And so I followed Bob into the job 8 years after he did it. It was an amazing challenge and an amazing privilege to do that job. Because you are the chief legal officer of the Treasury Department, it means that you are one of the few true generalists in the building. The secretary and the deputy secretary are obviously generalists, and that they have responsibility for the entire Treasury Department. But the same is also true of the General Counsel. And so you are involved in the broad span of things Treasury does, and people will be surprised by the scope of the things that exist in a modern finance ministry, and especially in the US Treasury Department, because you think about it as the IRS collecting taxes and dispersing amounts that are payable, and also borrowing money. And those are obviously the core functions of a treasury. But for us, it's a much broader remit. It's all the international functions I described a moment ago, but it's also sanctions and money laundering and financial intelligence. It's domestic financial regulation. It's interaction with international counterparts on coordinated financial regulation. So it's a remarkably broad remit, and getting to know all of those various functions that Treasury did was a real privilege. And it does being the General Counsel does translate nicely into the ability to move into one of the policy positions, because you are the lawyer for that policy position, regardless of which policy position it was. And so when my colleague, former Undersecretary David Malpass, became the president of the World Bank, I moved into his job, and my deputy as General Counsel moved into the job of General Counsel. So that was, I think, from our perspective, relatively seamless. But also it's a challenge and a privilege to serve in these roles.
Yeah, that's great. And so you are the top diplomat for the U.S. Treasury, and so in that, being the top diplomat, describe some of your key priorities that you had going in. How has that evolved? Because a lot of stuff you're adjusting as you're along the way. And then what have been some of the key challenges?
Yeah, so what I find interesting actually about the set of priorities we articulated for international affairs at Treasury when I assumed this role is that if anything, they've become, and this may be coincidence or not, they've become more important during the pandemic than they were even when we articulated them. Obviously, at this point, the primary priority for any finance ministry around the world is COVID response. And so I would be remiss if I didn't say that one of the things that has happened is that in the domestic programs we put together, both the stimulus programs under the CARES Act, as well as the various Fed facilities, which are backed by Treasury to stabilize various markets, including the credit markets. Those are items that have had to be done at Treasury, and there are not existing offices to do those. And so we've all had to chip in to work on those various programs. So in terms of, even though my role has international in the title, there has been an element during COVID, because of the all hands on deck nature of this crisis, of domestic COVID response. That said, when you look at the set of priorities we had for international affairs earlier this year, before we ever knew that COVID was going to be what it has become, it includes things like debt transparency and sustainability. So that is to say, helping countries understand what their debt position is in terms of their sovereign debt, and make sure that that position is sustainable. That has become all the more important during COVID, because so many countries are suffering and need additional fiscal space and need money from the international community, whether it's the international financial institutions or otherwise, to aid with their COVID response. And so it's impossible for them to do responsible borrowing in that context if they don't understand what their financial position is and don't have an understanding of what is and what is not sustainable for them. So that's become all the more important. Another of our issues was, how should we think about our relationship with China? That's obviously been something that's been evolving dramatically over the over this administration and previously as well. And so the pandemic, for obvious reasons that go without stating, has raised the prominence of that issue, both in America and around the world, how we should think about our relationships with China. Another of the aspects we were working on already were digital payments, digital assets, cryptocurrencies, stable coins, central bank digital currencies. That's kind of the spectrum, or there's not a neat bucket into which all those fall, but we were working on those issues. And that's become all the more important, both because certainly early in the pandemic, there was a sense that digital payments were a way of avoiding using cash. And second, just because there's been progress going forward in those industries during the pandemic in a way that has caused us to pay attention, really pay attention to them, and need to have a response. And then there have been, one of our priorities was showing the US leadership in various international bodies. So that especially was leadership in the G7 and driving the agenda in the G7, where we have the presidency. And the G7 has become all the more important, as has the G20, which is this year led by the Saudis. Those two items have become all the more important during a pandemic, because it's not coordination about what's going to happen in 6 months or a year or 2 years. It's not just ongoing surveillance, it's actual response to a crisis that's being done in those spaces. And so what's been interesting about those is, normally the pace of the meetings would be, we'd have an in-person meeting pretty regularly, maybe once a month. You'd see people somewhere around the world. We did a lot of trips to Saudi Arabia because of the G20, and so have been to Riyadh several times recently, and I was in Jeddah as well, and was expecting to be back to both. The in-person meetings have fallen off, but the pace of the meetings has increased for obvious reasons. And so we spend a huge amount of time on meetings like this with our international counterparts, talking through where the global economy stands, where particular countries' economies stand, and what can be done about the problems that they face because of the pandemic, and in some cases because of pre-existing economic situations exacerbated by the pandemic. And so, it's been fascinating how the priorities we had articulated beforehand have become all the more present and current and real in light of the pandemic.
So that jives well into the next set of questions, and we're going to hit a couple concrete issues and go for a little tour around the world, given our Trilat audience here this morning. First, and this is an issue you and I have discussed over the years, the US dollar, Brent. I mean, it's taken on probably a different meaning for you and others in the community. How do you view the role of the dollar with regards to sanctions, economic power? What is the right balance without overusing it? And that will obviously go into your view on the China digital currency Do you view it as a competitor, a threat? How serious is this coming to your desk?
Yeah, so the dollar as reserve currency of the world, and I should say not just as the reserve currency of the world, but as the currency in which a vast amount of international commerce is invoiced, which is a slightly separate point. The fact that the dollar serves in that role has both gives us both great authorities, but also great responsibilities for the dollar and for prudent management of the dollar and of the authorities that come with the dollar's preeminence in the international financial system. And so that has consequences for things like sanctions, where the US has an ability to sanction because of the number of the propensity of transactions to touch the dollar. We have the ability to take actions with our sanctions that are broader than countries that do not share the reserve currency status of the dollar. That said, we always feel, and my colleagues in the Terrorism and Financial Intelligence Undersecretariat, which includes our Office of Foreign Assets Control, which runs our sanctions programs, they feel a real responsibility to ensure that they are prudent and responsible with the way they use sanctions, so as to ensure that we are not imperiling the role of the dollar. It's clear that there are often tensions at the margin with other countries regarding our use of the dollar. But in the broad strokes, we tend to use it in a way that is responsible and thoughtful. You do hear people talking occasionally about the centrality of the dollar and whether it's imperiled. I see no evidence at this point that it's imperiled. As long as, there are a number of reasons why the dollar is central to the global economy, far beyond just, for example, the usability of the dollar that have to do with the prudence of the Federal Reserve and the prudence of the United States. And so ensuring that the dollar remains central to the global economy is important to us. But at present, there's not a move away from the dollar in any meaningful amount, and certainly we don't see the RMB becoming a reserve currency around the world at a time when there are issues with the Chinese system that would make that difficult, including their capital controls.
Now, during COVID, there has been some hearings being held, and I know the Fed and Treasury have been discussing the idea of a digital dollar, and to get ahead of what is coming. The Bank of England is announced they're going to come out probably with a digital pound in the coming years. Christine Lagarde's been very passionate in talking about a digital euro. Obviously, Mark Carney's speech at Jackson Hole talking about the dollar. Do you see the US observing others becoming digitally first and then stepping in? Or do you see the United States taking a more proactive role as the leader of the global reserve currency?
Yeah, I want to be deferential to my friends at the Federal Reserve on the ultimate policy question, the development of a central bank digital currency for the United States. It's worth stepping back a bit to think about what a central bank digital currency is. Currently, when you think about the forms of central bank money as opposed to sort of commercial money, there's cash and there are central bank reserves, but there's not a digital currency that's available to individuals. And so a number of different countries are thinking through whether it would make sense to have such a digital currency, a central bank digital currency, which would be akin to possibly some of the stablecoin ideas, except issued by a central bank. There are hard policy questions around that, which a number of them are thinking through. Some have been further forward-leaning on this, including the Chinese and the Swedes, but a lot of different central banks, including our own, and the Bank of England and the ECB, have been collaborating with international counterparts, including the Bank for International Settlements, to think through the questions of what the benefits and potential harms of a central bank digital currency are. And there are hard policy questions around that that I don't think can be swept under the rug. If you have it, depending on the design choices that are made with a central bank digital currency, you can have substantial data privacy issues, and that unlike cash, you would have the government having access to, in theory, all transaction records. And with that comes a certain amount of control to shut down those transactions. Cross-border adoption of, for example, a particular digital currency could deprive the countries where it's adopted of monetary sovereignty and control of their own monetary policy. There are operational resilience and cybersecurity concerns that the banks need to think through. And then, depending on the design features here, it has the possibility of causing disintermediation by banks, bank disintermediation, which could be a situation where it harms the provision of credit within a particular country. And so there are questions, design choices that need to be thought through here. And it's my sense that the central banks that are thinking about this are thinking through them carefully and thoughtfully, and not rushing to a central bank digital currency, but also recognizing that there are potential benefits to a central bank digital currency. And so I don't know what the sequencing of movement to a central bank digital currency, or whether there will be a move to ultimately a central bank digital currency. But I do think there's a lot of churn in terms of central banks working through the very real policy questions and design choices that would be called for by a central bank digital currency.
Right. So let's turn to Asia, and then we're going to hit on some Europe questions and Middle East before we get to Q&A. So let's turn to China first. Obviously, one of your key priorities, challenges. Lay out how you see this relationship with this competitor playing out in the next 4 to 8 years, and also take us in when you became undersecretary and you first visited China. What was your impression then, and what's your impression now?
So what I would say is I don't think my impression has changed a great deal as undersecretary. I think that the impression of the international community of China has changed over the course of the past decade, from the sort of Robert Zoellick presumption that they will become or wish, I should say, that they will become a responsible stakeholder, to very substantial concerns about a number of the economic practices, to say nothing of some of the broader human rights issues, but a number of the economic practices that China is undertaking. And so when we look at our own interaction with them, there are issues involving a number of their trade and investment practices, including forced technology transfers and forced joint ventures, and concerns about IP theft, that I think are very real concerns for American businesses and other businesses that do business with China. And so addressing those in a way that engages with the Chinese in an attempt to address them was part of the reason we negotiated the phase 1 trade deal. But there are very substantial concerns about those issues. And there are also, I think it's impossible to look at Hong Kong and not be concerned about what the actions of the Chinese government have been there, and Xinjiang as well. So I think there's a more clear-eyed vision of China, both in the United States in this administration, but I think there's actually a bipartisan consensus on the problems we face there. But also you hear it in talking with our international counterparts, that they see it in a very acute way, that they also need to be concerned about the practices in question. And then you see the investment China is making in other countries through the Belt and Road Initiative, and the non-transparency and often a lack of sustainability of that investment, and the problems it creates for those countries that accept that investment And it becomes, I mean, it's a troubling picture, and one that we need to be take seriously and proactively as a response to the practices that China has adopted in the international community. I mean, Secretary Mnuchin likes to say that there's not bipartisan agreement on a lot of things in DC, but there's definitely bipartisan agreement on this. I think, although we regard the Phase 1 trade deal as an important step in our relationship with China, there's a lot of work to be done to ensure that we are responding appropriately to the practices that the party has adopted under Xi.
So, under this administration, there's been a lot of different trade tools, economic tools that have evolved in the trade war against China. Some of the key financial institutions have been discussed in China. As Undersecretary, what is the fine line between pressuring a great competitor but not hurting the economics of the United States, given how closely we are intertwined with China? When you're thinking about that delicate balance and all the tools at our arsenal, when you're going into the DCs and getting the options, in the past, Treasury has probably pressed the pause and caution button more than others. How do you see that playing out in the years to come?
Yeah, I think that there's general consensus across the interagency, which is what we call in the United States, the various different agencies. Interagency started as an adjective and has become a noun, but across the interagency on the need to be vigilant and proactive and in response to the practices, whether they be economic or military or human rights practices that we're seeing out of China. And so I think that there's clearly, there are going to be times that we disagree on tactics, and sometimes maybe at the edges of strategy, but ultimately the goals and the broad strategy, I think there's a lot of consistency. And when you talk for people on the Hill, there's general agreement there as well. So I think that we recognize that US companies are going to have interests in China, and there are times when those interests may, in the short term, come in conflict with the broader strategic imperatives of dealing with a country that has adopted the practices that China has adopted. But ultimately, in the long term, we think that the interests of US businesses and the interests of the United States and our like-minded counterparts vis-a-vis China are pretty well aligned. And it doesn't benefit anyone for some of these practices that China has adopted in the economic space to become prevalent and accepted in the international community.
So I want to quickly shift to Japan and Singapore and then go to Europe. On Japan, the new Prime Minister Suga, how do you see this new era of economics playing out, and what should be the United States approach?
Yeah, so I think there's more continuity than disruption in the move from Abe to Suga. Japan has always been, in our experience, a responsible and sober player in the international community and the international financial and economic community. They do face tough demographic challenges. There's no question about that. But they have been a key partner of ours in on a number of fronts, including obviously the one we were just discussing with regard to China, where their proximity and familiarity with China gives them a real insightful position about the challenges that China presents. And they're obviously a very important member of the Quad, along with India and Australia. Which is an increasingly important strategic group for us. They're also, I would say, clear-eyed about things like the potential for, they're very concerned about the consequences of internationalization of the RMB in the same way that we are. which I, again, don't think is a near-term prospect because of the economic system and financial currency system that the Chinese currently run. But we're very close with them. I was in Tokyo. One of my last trips before international travel shut down was to Tokyo to meet with my international counterparts. And I speak very regularly with my Japanese counterparts because they really see a number of important topics in a way that's very similar to where the way we see them.
Yeah. So I want to turn to sovereign wealth funds, and how do you foresee Singapore and Norway remain as models for other sovereigns in this area? And obviously, when I was at Treasury, Santiago Principles was the key area we would talk about with sovereign wealth funds. Is this still the goal for Treasury, and how do you approach sovereign wealth funds?
Yeah, the Santiago Principles do remain central to our approach on sovereign wealth funds. And just to put that in context, that means that there are certain policy principles, a core set of policy principles that we believe are appropriate for sovereign wealth funds. So that's things like their investment decisions should be based on commercial grounds, not designed to advance geopolitical goals. We believe in greater information disclosure by sovereign wealth funds in areas like purpose and investment objectives, institutional arrangements, financial information, which can help reduce uncertainty in financial markets and build trust in recipient countries. It's strong governance structures and internal controls. It's fair competition with the private sector, and respect for host country rules, complying with applicable regulatory and disclosure requirements. And so we think that since the Santiago Principles, sovereign wealth funds have made really great strides in holding themselves to these standards, high standards, which, so that they can be broadly recognized as constructive long-term participants in international capital markets. And Singapore and Norway have certainly been leaders in that respect. And I would expect that they will continue in that way, and we would urge them to they are generally good actors there, and we would urge them to comply fully with the Santiago Principles. And we want all the sovereign wealth funds to move toward that, because it's a reform to that system that will be an important one for the international financial architecture.
So turning to CFIUS in Europe, with sovereign wealth funds, we've seen a boost of investment in the United States over the years. I saw it from the Middle East, just the amount of sovereign investment in the U.S. Tell us about Treasury's, changing approach to CFIUS. And Europe has been discussing putting in a CFIUS system of its own, given China's investment tentacles going into Europe and others. So talk about that, and have you been advising your EU colleagues about this as well?
Yeah, so just to put this in context, because I know it's more familiar to some than to others, CFIUS is our investment security regime, under which it's the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States. It periodically pops to the attention of the public and then recedes, but we are always in a steady process of reviewing investment in the United States to ensure that we remain a great investment climate, because we are vigilant about the possibility of malign investment and are careful about it. And that care and rigor actually empowers us to be a great investment climate. And obviously right now, the CFIUS has been in the news some recently, but CFIUS underwent a reform during this administration, very substantial one, to address some jurisdictional difficulties that CFIUS was facing in terms of the transactions that we could review, and to empower CFIUS to be more rigorous and more comprehensive in its review of inbound investment to the United States. And so one of the accomplishments of the Treasury Department during this administration has been standing up that more robust CFIUS effort. And that's not to say anything derogatory about the prior CFIUS effort. They were doing a fabulous job, but they needed certain additional authorities and resources, and they now have those. And we're making a very substantial effort to make our investment regime, which was investment security regime, which was already, I think, widely recognized as the best in the world, to make it all the better. And so there's a lot of work going on to implement those reforms. But at the same time, we have the benefit of 4 decades of successes and failures in the CFIUS space. And so one of the things we do is we interact regularly with our international counterparts, whether it's the Europeans or others, with regard to their own investment regimes, and to discuss with them what we see as best practices in that space, and give them the benefit of the ups and downs of the US CFIUS regime over the years. And so that has been all the more important during the pandemic, because I think there was a sense that the pandemic provided a target-rich opportunity for malign investment. And so it was our obligation to make sure that that did not become the case. And we don't believe it has become the case, because we really, as vigilant as we had been before the pandemic, we stepped up even more during the pandemic, and have been working with our international counterparts. And you see real progress in country after country on coming up with robust investment security protections and review regimes. And I think we're very heartened by the progress that has been made in a variety of like-minded countries to ensure that investments are made for commercial purposes, as opposed to national security harm that might befall the country in which inbound investment is received.
So on that point, do you see, I mean, the key financial centers right now, New York, okay, Hong Kong, and London, do you see those shifting? Do you see the 3 shifting? There's been discussion that given the recent, stalled IPO, that there may be a shift in financial centers. There's greater protections now to list in New York. How do you see that shifting?
Look, I think New York remains the gold standard when it comes to public listings. There can be a little question about that. And if that weren't true before the Ant Financial situation, it's all the more true today. If you're looking for neutral application of the rule of law, New York continues to be the gold standard there. I think what happens with regard to listings in various other locations, it depends on actions taken by the Chinese regime. You have to think that Hong Kong and Shanghai are maybe somewhat more suspect than they were a few years ago, despite their increasing prominence. With that prominence should come greater responsibility to ensure neutral application of the rule of law. And I guess I would say that if I were to evaluate that as a country contemplating an IPO, New York looks really good right now.
So 2 last questions, then I want to turn to our chair, Megan O'Sullivan, who has a great question. In a post-Merkel era, what role do you see Germany playing for Europe? Will they still be the leader, or will someone else take up their mantle?
So I don't see any reason why Germany wouldn't continue to be a leading voice in Europe. They are a prosperous and powerful country that has been a leading voice in Europe. They have a trade surplus, a very substantial trade surplus. They are a heavyweight in all their negotiations, both in the EU and around the world. And they are a key counterpart of ours, although, look, we don't agree on everything. We're in negotiations with them about their imposition of a digital services tax. We have negotiations to do with them with regard to the data privacy regime and its effect on United States companies. But they are ultimately a key counterpart of ours in the geopolitical world, whether it be vis-a-vis China or Russia. and also a key counterpart in response to the pandemic. They are a thoughtful and forceful interlocutor on that. And so I would expect that they will continue to play a central role, which is not to say that other European countries don't have a loud and useful voice here, but there's clearly a prominent role for Germany going forward, even post-Merkel.
I mean, in your discussions with the Europeans, especially on China, I mean, what are like the top 3 roadblocks that you hit where there could be more of a, I would say, a multilateral pressure campaign against China? Where do the Europeans want to be against China? Because I recall when we were pressuring the Europeans to join the U.S. more on Russia, it took some time, and we got them there. We pressured Russia pretty heavily on sanctions, but it seems like there could be more work to be done on China.
Yeah, I think, look, I think we see the China threat very clearly. And I'm not going to say that our international counterparts don't, but I do think there is a role for U.S. leadership in demonstrating the validity of the concerns we have. And so I think you see in places like, for example, 5G, our articulation of our concerns in that space. It takes time for people to understand exactly why we're concerned, but when they're confronted with the facts, they then share our concern. And so I wouldn't say that there are 3 roadblocks. I think this is an evolving process where we work through the various issues on the table, and it takes time to persuade everyone of what the facts on the ground are. But ultimately, I would say that the Europeans see the concerns we see. The United States has the benefit of being an immensely strong economy and willing to stand up and raise its hand on some of these issues that some countries that are less strong economically may not regard themselves as having the flexibility to do unless we help provide them the ammunition to do so. And so that's part of our responsibility and our leadership role to ensure that they see the facts on the ground and have know that we have their back when they assert that they too see problems.
Yeah, and obviously the Huawei campaign was very effective. And so, Megan, I want to turn to you. Our chair, Megan O'Sullivan, has a question.
Great. Thank you, Michael. And thank you, Brent, very much for this conversation. These are so many really important issues that really are in the forefront of national security as well as economic issues. So it's really a pleasure and a privilege for us to have you with us today. I've enjoyed listening to you and Michael. I wanted to ask you about the role of the G20. And we think about the last financial crisis, the really critical role that the G20 played in bringing back economic recovery. And I wondered if you saw a more prominent role for the G20 this time around. And in particular, I'm thinking about the developing world and anticipating, as I'm sure you are as well, the real difficulties the developing world is going to have when it's trying to come out of the economic recession from COVID. We've seen debt relief, and I'm wondering if you think there's more that developed countries should be doing for the developing world in this economically difficult time. And thank you again for joining us.
Thanks, Megan. It's nice to see you again. I think it's been a while since we saw each other, but a pleasure as always. I think the G20. I mean, one of the remarkable things about where we are in this crisis is the extent to which institutions created during the global financial crisis have served the role that we hoped they would. And so, it can be internally for us, the Financial Stability Oversight Council at which Treasury chairs internally has been very useful in coordinating our financial and economic response. And ensuring that we see the vulnerabilities. But then if you look internationally, you have things like the G20 and the Financial Stability Board. And I would be remiss if I didn't say how well the Financial Stability Board has functioned under the head of the Financial Stability Board for this period is Fed Vice Chair Randy Quarles, who has done a fabulous job ensuring that that the advanced economies are looking at the financial stability consequences of the pandemic and of the actions we take in response to the pandemic. And that has been, I mean, that was an institution that was made, it really came about in its current form after the global financial crisis and has been, I would say, a success story of the post-global financial crisis period. Similarly, the G20 under the leadership of the Saudis, look, you know, every country, when you run something like the G20, you want to have people in your capital and you want to have a variety of different things to talk about. And the Saudis have had to deal with the fact that the G20 moved in a different direction this year because of the pandemic. And they have been fabulous about adapting their priorities to the current global situation and using the G20 in the way that it needs to be used. There's a lot more work to be done at the G20. The G20 in the spring adopted what we call the Debt Service Suspension Initiative, which allowed the poorest 80-some countries in the world to request of all their official bilateral creditors suspension of their debt service payments to create additional fiscal space to respond to the crisis. That was a 6-month suspension at a time when we thought 6 months was going to be sufficient. That has subsequently been extended into 2021 by the G20. But the G20 also recognizes that merely suspending payments on debt is not going to be enough for a lot of countries. And so the G20 is currently in negotiations, including a session tomorrow morning among finance ministers and central bank governors to work on what is the process, the framework, the thinking around countries where it's not just a need for, because of the pandemic and their pre-existing situations, it's not just a need for for their debt service payments to be put off, but they fundamentally need relief on their debt. And it's been, look, it takes time to negotiate these things. And, you know, there are a lot of different players. The Chinese, we were discussing earlier, the Chinese are the largest borrower to many of these countries. And so we need them to engage in full and faithful and transparent participation in these debt relief efforts, both the suspension of debt service payments and ultimate debt treatments for those countries that are going to need greater debt relief. And so we're working to bring along our international counterparts. The G7 countries have been terrific in pushing for this, but it takes negotiation. And I will say I commend the Saudis on the work they have done in the presidency to stand up to a historic moment. And it was not what they thought their priority was going to be coming into their G20 presidency, but they've done a great job working to bring consensus to the G20 on debt relief and debt suspension at a time when there's no question it's desperately needed in a variety of lower income countries.
Great, thank you.
Thanks, Megan.
Others that have questions, just unmute yourself or raise your hand.
Yes, just to speak or?
Yeah, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you for a very interesting conversation. My name is Ahmed Abdurrahman. I'm calling from Sweden. My question is, as you mentioned, a few of the issues you're working with when it comes to financing and especially keeping an eye on what's happening around the world, terror financing, for example. There's a huge issue in terms of financing from families and friends who are sending remittance to countries. And that's sometimes their only lifeline. So my question to you is that how are you guys balancing that? And there's been a lot of issues from certain groups when you send money back to, especially Africa, Somalia, where I'm from originally. So what is your take on that? And how do you guys help Americans or other countries find a right way to do it rather than just shutting it down?
Yeah, it's a great question. because there are a number of lower income countries where remittances constitute a substantial portion of the economic wherewithal of the population. And so, we have a balance to strike between ensuring that those flows do not come to a halt, and yet ensuring that we are not in a place where what we're doing is allowing the financing of illicit activity, whether it be terrorism or other activities that we regard as problematic. And so there is a huge amount of work done at Treasury to ensure that we are being thoughtful about that. And one thing I will say is we thought that there would be essentially a stop in remittances because of the pandemic. The data haven't actually shown that. There have been differential results for different countries, but in a number of countries, remittances have continued as one would expect, despite the pandemic, which it's something we've been paying close attention to because of the consequences it could have for the economies, for a number of economies where a substantial portion of the GDP is actually is inflows from remittances. But look, it's a great question. It's a balance we always have to strike. And my colleagues who work in where Michael used to work in terrorism and financial intelligence spend a lot of time thinking about how to strike that balance to ensure that they're capturing and stopping problematic flows while not impeding all remittance flows, given their importance to various economies.
Yeah. Other questions?
I'll hop in. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes, perfectly.
Great. Michael, thank you for having me. And Brent, thank you for speaking to us today. Very, very interesting. I'm going to give Megan a little bit of flack because she stole my question, given that the summit's coming up in less than 2 weeks. But I do have another question. What would you say are the biggest impacts or changes that the pandemic will have in terms of future global coordination, global financial coordination, just given the economic fallout from the pandemic?
Yeah, it's a great question. What's interesting about it is I think that it has pressure tested the international financial system. And in a lot of cases, the international financial system has actually stood up very well. So we talked earlier about the work of the Financial Stability Board. That has focused very well. But in the Financial Stability Board, what I would say is we've gone from a time when we were focused purely on pandemic response to we continue to be focused on pandemic response, but we're also looking at the lessons learned from the pandemic, whether it's the role of money market funds in the March market turmoil or things like that. And so there clearly is going to be even greater collaboration on those sorts of questions going forward. And you see similarly, I think there's been a lot of innovative and rapid work at the international financial institutions. And I would highlight especially, I think the World Bank and the IMF under David Malpass and Kristalina Georgieva, respectively, have really stepped up to the plate in a meaningful way here. And I think that what we see is there are aspects of what they have done that are tools that we would use when there is a need for rapid response that we would not use in other situations. And so I think that going forward, once we have the whole thing stabilized, there will be an effort to look at the toolkit of the international financial institutions and ensure that we know what is the steady state set of tools and what set of things should we do in response to an emergency such as this one, and how could we take what we did over this pandemic and what was effective, what was ineffective, what could be tweaked, what should be discarded, what should be kept for emergency purposes, what should be built into our regular toolkit. And so I think that the pandemic has given us, because of the pressure testing of the system, it's given us an opportunity, once we're past it, to look at those responses and build them into our emergency response toolkit for a possible future crisis, whether it be financial or health related or whatever it may be.
Great. I think we have time for one more brief one, if anyone has more questions. Yes, please unmute yourself.
Hi, thanks Brent, thanks Michael. It's a question, my name is Julia, I'm calling from London. My question actually stems from the last sentence of your answer. And it's about how we can move from pandemic response to pandemic preparedness or pandemic prevention with the tools and lessons that we've learned this time round. The Financial Stability Board and the lessons we've learned from 2008, 2009 has put us in somewhat more stable stead. But going forward, as we see definitely more health challenges, because coronavirus is mutating all the time around us, even though we can't see it, what tools can we have for preparedness?
Yeah, so my space is the economic and financial. I'm gonna leave the health side of pandemic preparedness to the experts in that space. But what I'll say is that if you look at what these institutions are doing, they are undertaking currently, while they recognize we're not out of the woods, they also realize that this is the time for reflection and adaptation of the measures we've taken. And so you look at, for example, the Financial Stability Board has put together a review of the various actions that were taken and in response to the March market turmoil and how they worked, how they functioned, what worked well, what worked poorly. And so I do think that as we move forward, those reviews, and I don't want to prejudge the results of any of those reviews, but there are clearly lessons to be learned from the actions we took. I mean, we in the United States see that one of the lessons is programs we did that used pre-existing institutions were easier than programs that need to be stood up. That may seem obvious, but it's not obvious when you're drafting the legislation that it's a lot easier to use a bank with a lending department to lend than to use an institution that has not done that previously. And so those sorts of lessons, there is, even as we continue to be focused on what responses need to be taken now, even now there is work being done to ensure that we've reviewed what we did, what we didn't do, and evaluated the response measures we took to ensure that the next time this comes around, whether it be a pandemic or some other cause of an economic crisis, we've thought through what worked, what didn't work, and how we should respond. So I think that if anything positive comes out of the pandemic, one of the things that will come out of it is we will have thought through these sorts of hard questions based on real world uses of those tools.
Brent, I want to thank you so much for joining us today. I know we were back in March supposed to meet in the Treasury Department, and I know we were all looking forward to that, but I'm so glad we were able to do this and to see your home office. On behalf of Megan, Richard, Cassandra, and everyone here today, on behalf of North America Trilateral and Trilateral, we're so happy to have had this conversation with you, and thank you for all your service in the work and the work you have coming up. So again, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me. It's a delight to see you, Michael and Megan. Thanks for the great work you do. And I look forward to further discussions.
Great. Thank you, Brent. And thanks again for your service.
Great. Take care, everyone. Thanks for participating.